let's start by going to this slide. I've covered this in the past with my talk on Hitler versus Christianity. So this is the Nuremberg trials, which happened after World War II. Welcome, Students Impact. And yeah, so what you have is Julius Streicher, Nazi propagandist, published anti-Semitic paper called Der Stürmer, or the Stormer. This is Mr. Julius Streicher here. So he ends up in the dock at the Nuremberg trials, and the lawyer says to him, "Witness, what aims did you pursue with your speeches and your articles in Der Stürmer?" That happened on 29 April 1946. Welcome, Artsy Fartsy and Ower. Julius Streicher says, the speeches and articles which I wrote were meant to inform the public on a question which appeared to me one of the most important questions. I did not intend to agitate or inflame, but to enlighten. Streicher, anti-Semitic publications have existed in Germany for centuries. A book I had, written by Dr. Martin Luther, was, for instance, confiscated. Dr. Martin Luther would very probably sit in my place in the defendant's dock today if this book had been taken into consideration by the prosecution. In the book, The Jews and Their Lies, Dr. Martin Luther writes that the Jews are a serpent's brood, and one should burn down their synagogues and destroy them. Streicher, the book Trust No Fox in the Field and No Jew Under His Oath was done and illustrated by a young woman artist, and she also wrote the text. The title, which appears on the picture book, is from Dr. Martin Luther. So, Martin Luther, this is something I've watched numerous videos on YouTube with Protestant theologians discussing Martin Luther's anti-Semitism and working very hard to deny the obvious, deny reality, deny history, and to downplay it, to eliminate it. We had numerous, and I mean numerous, Protestant scholars and theologians who were editing the Bible to make it align with Nazi theology and were collaborating with the Nazis. So the 1945 Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, known as the Stuttgart Confession, was a declaration by the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany on October 19th. It admitted that they did not oppose the Third Reich, right? And they were confessing guilt for the church's failure to resist the Nazis and their atrocities. So this was most definitely an official admission. And then, of course, you had the 1950 Weissenseer Statement, was a declaration issued by the Federation of Evangelical Churches in the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany. And basically, it was a response to the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt and aimed to provide a more comprehensive examination of the church's role in the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. So do understand there's a lot of history that Protestants have swept under the rug and claimed, no, it was Hitler's Pope, when it was anything but. But we do have Hitler's Protestants. And of course, we do have Hitler's Luther. She says anti-Semitism is defined as discrimination against or prejudice or hostility towards Jews. This hatred and judgment towards Jewish people is not a recent phenomenon and is not uncommon. Anti-Semitism has its origins as early as paganism, even before the existence of Christianity. This was something that was actually very prevalent also amongst the Gnostics. The Gnostics went out of their way to misinterpret and reinterpret the Bible, especially I've quoted this before in the past on my discussions on Gnosticism, where they try to claim that the God of the Jews is the father of Satan. So that they try to reinterpret one particular passage in the Bible, stating that the Jews worship the father of Satan. So yeah, so this belief obviously has made its way. Many quote-unquote Christians have taken a lot of, shall we say, education from Adolf Hitler, Martin Luther, and others, and decided that, yes, the Jews have to be genocided, the Jews are evil, but we'll get there. So the roots of Christian anti-Semitism lie in the belief that the Jews killed Christ, the divine Savior. This belief made the Jews the enemy of Christians, causing a hatred that has lasted centuries. Two of the most notorious, unshakable anti-Semites were the Protestant reformer Martin Luther and German Chancellor turned dictator Adolf Hitler. Just zoom in a little bit more to this. There is no hiding the evil that occurred under Hitler's reign. The sinister side of Luther has been well hidden since his time. Well, the internet is going to open that door. Those skeletons are going to come out of the closet, allowing only his enlightened and reformist persona to be remembered and hailed. Many would be surprised to find out that Luther was extraordinarily anti-Judaic, and he became increasingly more vile and more hateful as he aged. He wanted to convert the Jews, and he took their refusal personally, eventually became consumed with bitter hatred. His rage led to texts and sermons that explicitly detailed why the Jews were wicked and what should be done, up to and including murdering them. There is little difference between anti-Semitic ideologies of Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler. So Martin Luther was highly nationalistic, as was Adolf Hitler, although Adolf Hitler had a particular slant to his particular nationalism. So he altered the psyche of the German people and left them open to these views. Francis Boole says, Protestants would refuse to call St. Mary Mother of God because it doesn't feel right to them, but when it comes to Martin Luther, he's such a saint. Yeah, it's saying once we unpack Luther, you're going to discover Martin Luther was a blasphemous heretic. The man was a vile, disgusting human, absolutely shocking human being, but we shall be discussing. So we will explain how Luther laid the foundation for Hitler's Holocaust. Now, of course, what I'm going to hear is that, well, that's on those people for misrepresenting and misinterpreting Martin Luther. No. They read Luther 100% and they followed Luther's 5-step plan to the letter. Okay? I feel much freer now that I'm certain the Pope is the Antichrist. So Martin Luther, and we're going to be going through Martin Luther was a superb propagandist. He wrote the most insulting, disgusting things. You'd be shocked at the kind of, I was shocked at the kind of thing that he wrote, the kind of things he said. But Martin Luther quite explicitly called the Pope the Antichrist, that the Pope sits with his mouth under the anus of Satan and Satan poops into his mouth and he eats it and they slobber it up like pigs. And I mean, man, it gets disgusting. Yes, so Protestant scholars were deliberately searching for a way to bypass 1500 years of the historical record. Yes, that's exactly what they did. Martin Luther is born November 10th. That date is important, and we'll see why, because an event called the Night of the Long Knives occurs as well, where the Nazis decide to kill their political enemies. And of course, that was, in one sense, their celebration of Martin Luther's birthday, in honor of Martin Luther. They decided to murder all of their political enemies. In Luther's Germany, there was a class struggle between the princes and the peasants. And we know that Luther obviously came down on the side of the princes, and he got a lot of peasants murdered. So Luther called the princes. Now, okay, so the peasants came to him because they wanted support, because they were being abused. The peasants were being abused by the princes, right? These poor peasants. So Luther called the princes the greatest fools and the worst scoundrels on earth. The people will not any longer endure your tyranny and your presumption. And with this encouragement and united front from the peasants, a revolt ensued in 1525. Martin Luther refused to officially stand as the peasants' leader, though. And he said it was not his place as a minister to take the sword, and instead he sided with the princes. Martin Luther wrote against the murderous and thieving hordes of peasants, of which the most famous line read, "Therefore let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, secretly or openly, remembering that nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel." So Martin Luther writes. So Martin Luther says, "Oh, those princes are bad. You peasants are being oppressed." And then when the peasants revolt, Martin Luther sides with the princes, and writes that everyone should take up weapons and murder the peasants. They should kill them, stab them, slay them, secretly or openly, because there's nothing more poisonous or hurtful than these peasants. To Luther, if a peasant was willing to rebel, then he was outside the law of God and deserved what was coming to him. When it was over, 100,000 peasants were killed, and Luther was labeled a traitor by the peasants. The Catholic princes held Luther responsible for the entire episode. Luther added fuel to the fire. Luther became increasingly more angry and anti-Judaic with age. Right, so Luther argued that stronger actions were required to deal with the Jewish problem. He declared to his fellow Christians, next to the devil, you have no more bitter, more poisonous, more vehement an enemy than a real Jew who earnestly desires to be a Jew. Wasn't there a guy called Muhammad that said something similar to that? Am I wrong? Hey, let me know. Did a guy called Muhammad say something very, very similar? In order to spread his vicious anti-Judaic sentiments, he requested that other pastors and preachers follow his example and issue warnings of their own against the Jews in 1543.